So greetings everyone and welcome to the Voices in Vegan Studies speaker series brought to you by Arihanta Institute. Today, we will enjoy a presentation by Dr. Vasile Stănescu. For those of you who don't know much about Arihanta Institute, we are a California nonprofit organization dedicated to advancing education, scholarship, critical research, and public engagement grounded in the principles of nonviolence and compassion. As part of our programming, we offer numerous types of courses and talks and conferences and podcast events under our Vegan Studies initiative, which began in late 2023, of which I am the lead. And I should mention, I'm Jonathan Dickstein, Assistant Professor of Jain and Vegan Studies at Arihanta Institute, and as said, the one who leads the Vegan Studies program. This is our second year of the Voices in Vegan Studies speaker series. We had a wonderful lineup in 2024. We took a break at Arihanta for a different series, our Compassion Studies series, and then we returned this year for another fantastic slate of speakers in our Vegan Studies programming. So first off, I just want to say, Dr. Stănescu, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having
me. Wonderful. So today's talk is titled Becoming Part of the Family, Greenwashing, Animal Agriculture, and the Strategic Control of Climate Research by Dr. Vasile Stănescu. Dr. Stănescu is an associate professor in the Department of Communication at Mercer University in the US. He holds a PhD in Modern Thought and Literature from Stanford University, where he focused on environmental rhetoric. Dr. Stănescu's work examines animal studies, food studies, media studies, and environmental communication, with particular attention to the intersections of consumer culture, capitalism, and animal liberation. He has conducted research on locavorism, humane meat, lab-grown meat, and the ethics of invasive species removal. His current work explores greenwashing strategies in animal agriculture and their relationship to climate change discourse. His scholarship has been cited in The Guardian, Vox, The New York Times, and Bloomberg News. Also, Dr. Stănescu is actually the first instructor of a self-paced course in our Vegan Studies program, having taught course 1015, Debunking the Myth of Sustainable and Humane Animal Agriculture. I will drop a link to that in the chat. It is still one of our most widely taken courses, and so I strongly encourage anyone at this talk or watching it in the future to sign up for that class. Dr. Stănescu will also be presenting on a wonderful panel on the problems of cage-free eggs at our upcoming Shared Worlds conference on August 1st. Lastly, you can visit his website at www.winforanimals.org. Before we begin, I just want to give a future plug for the next talk in our series. You know, they say people only remember what you say at the beginning and the end of a meeting, so I'm going to start with this as well. We're taking a break in August of our speakers because of the conference, and then on September 21st, Claire Jean Kim will give a talk titled Fighting for Animals in a Time of Danger. So put that on your calendar, Monday, September 21st, 2026. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Stănescu. Thanks again.
Thank you so much. Before I begin, a brief disclaimer. The factual claims in the presentation are from publicly available records, published scholarships, and sources identified through the presentation and accompanying articles. I've made every reasonable effort to present the material accurately and in context. However, as a verbal presentation, not read from notes, small variations can occur. Anyone seeking the authoritative statement of my claims should always consult my published scholarship. Terms such as greenwashing, industry influence, and academic capture are explained and used as scholarly analytic concepts only. The presentation does not allege any form of criminal conduct. Before I begin, a few thank yous. I would first like to thank the Climate Social Science Network at Brown University, where I'm a research scholar. They have funded my work now twice. So they've given me one grant that I'm presenting today. So that's the Becoming Part of the Family paper that just came out with Oxford University Press, basically like last month. They have now given me a second grant for my future research that we can talk about in the Q&A. I would like to thank Jennifer Jacquet. We'll be returning to her throughout the presentation. She is the co-leader of the Animal Agriculture track at the Climate Social Science Network and has really been a mentor for me in my work, both conceptually and personally. I did a presentation of this research earlier for the Animal Agriculture track, and she and that entire committee, which is wonderful, gave me extremely helpful feedback that allowed my research to steadily progress. I would like to thank both of my research assistants, Bethany and Isabella. I am truly horrible at PowerPoint presentations. So if this presentation looks nice at all, it is 100% because of Isabella and 0% because of me. Finally, and most importantly, I would like to thank Jonathan and Christopher Jane and the Arihanta Institute. As you heard him mention before, they invited me to give a class on this topic. I had never done that before on an online setting. It was an incredible experience. It was a joy to get to meet all of the people that were part of that class. I think they are becoming one of the leading sources of vegan scholarship there is. I have been steadily impressed now for many years. And at the end of this, if you would like more detailed information on precisely the concepts that I'm presenting today, I strongly recommend that you take a second to go through that class and all of the other classes that they offer as well. Becoming Part of the Family, Greenwashing Animal Agriculture, and the Strategic Capture of Climate Research. Before I start to main concepts, greenwashing and academic capture. What is greenwashing? Greenwashing is an attempt by a company or a corporation to hide their environmental effects to make them seem less polluting and damaging than they actually are. The example that I always use is mayonnaise. Used to be shipped in glass. Glass is one of the best materials we can use. A pound of glass makes a pound of glass forever. They shifted to plastic to save money, and then they did a series of published articles claiming that they'd done this because it was better for the environment, because they used less emissions to ship it, because plastic weighs less than glass. In reality, emissions went up. Obviously, plastic is worse than glass for the environment. That is an example of greenwashing. What they said is technically true. It is true that plastic weighs less than glass, but wholly misleading. So greenwashing is an attempt by corporations or anyone to hide their true environmental effects and to trick the public and regulators to think they are less polluting than they really are. Academic capture. What is that? That is an attempt by corporations to shift what scholars say about that corporation. To be clear, it does not mean that everything that that scholar says is necessarily untrue. A concept that we'll be returning to throughout this presentation is the ability to lie by telling the truth. So the best example of this is the tobacco industry. In the height of tobacco sales, so the late 1950s, early 1960s, was the world's second leading funder of all forms of scientific research in the entire world. Why was this? Because if you wanted to research anything at all that could cause lung cancer other than tobacco, they were thrilled to give you that money. That does not mean that those researchers were corrupt. It does not mean that those researchers, their evidence was necessarily untrue. Some of the actual factual research we have about, say, asbestos was funded by the tobacco industry. It is to say that the companies are funding this research in order to shift the conversation and to shift what kind of research is valued, seen, and understood. So my research for the last 7 years, I'll be sort of summarizing the 7 years of research in this presentation, has focused on the kind of intersection of both of these. How is it the big ag is using academic capture, influencing academics and researchers in order to greenwash the industry, in order to make what is in fact a very polluting industry seem less polluting, and what are the techniques that they are able to do so. So how have they used academic capture, influencing researchers in order to achieve greenwashing, making a highly polluting industry seem less polluting? And here is sort of the fundamental question and sort of why this research matters and why I spent the last 7 years working on it. This is an article title from The Guardian, and you'll see it says, the UN says eat less meat to curb global warming. And you can see that date is 2008. So this was just a short while, about 2 years after the livestock's long shadow. This report we'll come back to came out. That came out in 2006. And you'll see even by 2008, we still saw these kinds of headlines everywhere. And I show you this headline as sort of a stand-in for a host of others that all occurred. There were meat-free Mondays. There were school boards that were trying to decrease meat. There were city governments. There were national governments across the board. And they were implementing policies, trying to shift the policy initiatives to be able to change the amount that people ate meat. So how do we come from that to this? This is the same publication, The Guardian. And here we see bewildering to omit meat-eating reduction from the UN climate plan. Academic experts also criticized the UN Food and Agriculture Organization for dismissing alternative proteins. So how do we shift from here to here? And let me pause to explain about why I think this is so particularly important. One of the questions that I get is, hey, this is the Vegan Studies series. We care about animals. How does talking about climate change have to do with animals? And so I would make two rejoinders. The first rejoinder is that animals themselves are already and will continue to be harshly affected by climate change. The people who are going to suffer the most from climate change are not human animals, but all of the other ones. There's mass species extinction happening right now. Species in the wild are going extinct at rates never seen before, and it's primarily because of human-caused climate change. Farmed animals are already suffering from heat exhaustion and other impacts from climate change. So we have a saying in the movement, you can't be a meat-eating environmentalist, which I agree, but I would say the opposite is also true. You cannot be someone who passionately cares about animal rights or liberation and not care about climate change. Climate change is already harming animals and will continue to harm animals. That is an issue we have to care about. But the second issue I would say is that certain prominent, well-known people in the movement have made a claim that it is human nature to eat meat. But what this research shows in clear detail is that this is not the case. Right now, today, in the Netherlands, per capita meat consumption is going down. And it's going down in part because of large-scale government policies that have tried to decrease the amount of meat that they're eating. Basically, that first headline has stayed true in the Netherlands because big ag in the Netherlands did not effectively shift the conversation. Meat consumption is going down in Germany. Meat consumption is going down in the UK. If it was human nature to eat meat, such changes would be impossible, and the industry would not feel the need to try to constantly prop up the amount of meat consumption that's happening globally. So it is like if someone saw the large amount of smoking that was happening in the late 1950s and early 60s and said that it was human nature to smoke while ignoring all of the techniques that the industry was using in order to trick the public and regulators to keep up this artificially high rate of smoking. So the same way that we were able to significantly decrease the rate of smoking, we can significantly decrease the rate of meat consumption. And this shows partly how the industry is trying to stop those changes. So Livestock's Long Shadow happened 20 years ago. There recently was a conference that just happened. The Livestock's Long Shadow revised 20 years later. It was a 391-page report. And as we mentioned before, it made national and international headlines by the claim that animal agriculture had such a significant negative impact on the environment that urgent action was required. Urgent action was required 20 years ago. And in this report, there's one particular part that really stood out to people, which is that they said the greenhouse gas emissions were 18%. And the report said this was a higher amount than transportation, which are only around 14%. And this idea really took off to the public that emissions from animal agriculture were higher than the share of all forms of transportation combined. Every plane, train, automobile, that seems to be the focus of many environmentalists. You combine all of them, animal agriculture is higher than that. I'll also underscore what I think is a somewhat forgotten part about this report, which is separate from the greenhouse gas emissions. The report also found that animal agriculture was the leading, not the second, the number one cause of biodiversity loss and species extinction. So that also is an environmental effect, and that one was number one. So how did the industry respond to this report and to the large amount of media coverage this report generated, and to the growing policy levels that were happening at multiple levels of government in order to decrease the consumption of meat? Well, one example is this gentleman right here. So his name is Frank Mitloehner, and as you can see from his shirt, he is a research scientist at UC Davis. And he published this paper, Clearing the Air: Livestock's Contribution to Climate Change. Now, in this paper, he made two claims. The first claim, which was not his major claim, is that this 18% was a global average that told us about the entire world, but didn't tell us about any particular country. So, for example, the United States or Canada. That is completely true. The authors of the report admit that. They followed up with later research to break it down country by country. His main argument, however, was this. When Livestock's Long Shadow, this 391-page report, included the sentence that animal agriculture was 18% of greenhouse gas emissions and that this was a larger share than transportation, a single sentence included purely for the purposes of comparison, just so people could understand how big 18% was, that this was wrong. Not because it undercounted the rate of animal agriculture, not because that 18% was wrong, but just because it undercounted the rate of emissions from transportation. And so what he said was this. When they did animal agriculture, they did a full life cycle analysis. And when they did transportation, they failed to do a full life cycle analysis. So the actual total emissions was higher from transportation. So what is a life cycle analysis? And the life cycle analysis, if you were to do a car, means that you look at all of the emissions that are made, not just what comes out of the tailpipe, but all the emissions that go into making the car. So mining the materials, shipping the materials, building the car, shipping the car, disposing of the car after it's used, a full life cycle of all the possible emissions that go into the product ever existing at all. So for animal agriculture, they did a full life cycle analysis, not just the burps and flatulence that the animals make, but in raising the animals, shipping the feed, shipping the meat, a full life cycle analysis. And the report, when they talked about transportation, they just measured the direct emissions, just the emissions coming out of the tailpipe. But here's the point. It was one sentence, only for the purpose of comparison, and it did not change the fundamental argument of the report at all. It did not argue, it did not find that the claim that the emissions from animal agriculture was wrong in any way. It did not suggest that people should not reduce their consumption of meat. It did not disprove the report. If you want to make the entire report absolutely correct, you can easily fix it this way. The emissions from animal agriculture is 18%, a share larger than the direct emissions of all forms of transportation combined. So that is what his paper actually proved. However, that is not the way that his research was reproduced in the media. So, for example, this is Fox News, and you can see the headline, "Eat Less Meat, Reduce Global Warming or Not," even though in reality, his report did not suggest in any way that we shouldn't reduce our consumption of meat, and suggested, left intact, the argument that animal agriculture produced 18% of greenhouse gas emissions. This is CNN scientist, that scientist being Frank Mitloehner, don't blame cows for climate change. Even though, again, his actual peer-reviewed data in no way suggested that cows shouldn't be blamed for climate change, did not dispute the 18%, and focused on a single sentence included only for the purposes of comparison in a 391-page report. Before we move on, though, I would highlight this effect of academic capture. Do you see how it says scientist, colon? So it's one researcher who does animal ag with significant ties to the industry, but all of that becomes compressed to a headline that millions of people see that says scientist. So this suggests that what science has determined is that we shouldn't blame cows for climate change, even though no such science was shown for this article. This is Time Magazine. So we're getting Fox News, CNN, Time Magazine. Meat eating versus driving, another climate change error. This is better than the others. At least it's comparing meat eating versus driving. But it is not true that somehow the report was debunked. And this is actually where I got the title for my paper, Cowgate. So they reference an earlier move by the petroleum industry to debunk climate change related to the fossil fuel industry. And they claimed that it was ClimateGate because they found small errors in long reports. And here they call it Cowgate and argue that we should dismiss this report because of one error. So this sort of rhetorical strategy that's being used is the attempt to find an error, no matter how small or unrelated to the larger argument. And if there's one error whatsoever, then somehow the entire report is debunked. That is the way it is rendered in the media, and that just obviously confuses the public. So this is one of the rhetorical ploys, even though, as we've highlighted, it doesn't change the reality that animal agriculture is releasing 18% of greenhouse gas emissions. This is one of the best examples of this power, this efficacy of this academic capture and greenwashing. So this is Maclean's. It's a major publication in Canada, like Newsweek. And you'll see here is the title, Save the Planet, Stop Eating Meat. The UN says so, and so do a growing list of school boards, Meet the New Eco-Enemy. So this is a powerful headline that millions of people see. This is what I was talking about earlier, that first one I showed that was coming out. This is what we saw in the media after livestock's long shadow. It literally tells people to stop eating meat. It references these government policies. It references the school board. It's not an editorial, it's an article. And the article itself suggests that they need to make policy decisions in Canada to decrease the consumption of meat in order to save the environment. And this is the same publication. This is the same journalist. After he talks to Frank Mitloehner, the new title becomes, Where's the Beef? Scientist, that scientist being only Frank Mitloehner, takes a second look at UN numbers that have led many environmentalists to forego meat. And the article itself suggests perhaps he was too hasty to call for these government changes. So we can see in a test case of the same publication of the same journalist, the efficacy of strategic capture, the scientist, and of greenwashing, the ability of big ag, the industry, to change this headline to this headline, from stop eating meat to where's the beef. And here's the main takeaway. I know this change not because of independent research I did, but because of a talk that Frank Mitloehner did. I think it was in Las Vegas. And it was at a seminar for dairy profit, or the Western Dairy Profit Seminar, a big ag seminar, in which Frank Mitloehner received an award by Big Ag for preventing regulation, which he accepted. And he gave a talk at this conference, and at this conference, he explained to the industry his benefit. Let's give it a read. This is the equivalent of Newsweek in Canada. It's called Maclean's. A year ago, they said, save the planet, stop eating meat. The UN says so, and so do a growing list of school boards. Meet the new eco-enemy. The same journalist who wrote this article a year ago called me after my talk at the American Chemical Society and now says, where's the beef? Scientists take a second look at UN numbers that have led many environmentalists to forego meat. Totally different article written by the same journalist. Totally. Things very averse to your industry and then turned around completely once they get the facts right. CNN put it out and it was listened to and read by 20 million people. You know, CNN will really have a major impact if you hit that. And if you think it's the only a question in Europe or the United States, it's not. Australia wrote about it, numerous articles, but it went farther than that. I always wanted to know how to spell my name in Chinese. Now I know how to because it went there. It went to India. It went all over the world. It was Turkey and Argentina and China and Taiwan, everywhere in the world. So when, as academics, as people involved in nonprofits, as policymakers, we wonder, what happened? How is it that these reports that just keep happening, how is it that all of this media attention we saw didn't seem to lead to policy changes? I suggest we don't have to wonder because they tell us directly. What happened was academic capture and greenwashing that was able to change the conversation, shift the news articles, and trick the public and the consumers. And here is a scientist speaking to the industry, explaining his benefit to them at a conference called the Western Dairy Profits Seminar, where he receives an award for preventing regulation. What none of these articles included is the fact that Frank Mitloehner is not even trained in climate scientists. You can see that his PhD is in animal science. What none of these articles included is the fact he has significant financial ties with the industry. That gives him direct funding for his research, including that article that we saw, that gives him indirect funding via organizations that sound like they're not animal ag, but actually are exclusively funded by animal ag, the Committee for Clean Air, these sorts of euphemistic names, that he attends their conferences, that he publishes in their publications. All of this is left out. As we've noticed, it's just reproduced scientist. Scientist says. However, there is a bit of good news to this story. So this is my original article, Cowgate, that came out. It was seized upon by the researchers that I mentioned before. So my article about Cowgate ends, as many academic articles does, with this rousing call that, hey, other people need to explore this research. If we don't take the sort of ploys the industry are taking seriously, we won't be able to confront animal agriculture in a similar way that we've failed to be able to confront the fossil fuel industry. That they're taking a page from the playbook of disinformation and strategic capture, confusing the public, confusing the media, confusing regulators, and so we need to be able to respond to them. Academics make these sort of calls all the time. Seldom do they actually catch on. But because of these two remarkable people, Jennifer Jacquet, originally at NYU and now at the University of Miami, and Vivek Morris, the executive director of Yale's Law School Ethics and Animal Program, and these are the two co-directors of the animal track, the animal agriculture track of the Climate Social Science Network. They, along with a host of other researchers, produced a flurry of amazing academic articles that all help to expose what is going on. This is one of them, The Climate Responsibility of Industrial Meat and Dairy Producers. If you haven't had a chance to check out this article, I highly recommend that you do. In addition to this plethora of excellent peer-reviewed work that these amazing scholars did, they also had the sort of social ability to be able to get the information into mainstream media in a host of different ways. So, for example, this is The Guardian. Remember, we started with The Guardian and the two articles by The Guardian. Inside Big Beef's climate messaging machine, confuse, defend, and downplay. And The Guardian article specifically talks about Cowgate and specifically talks about the critique of Frank Mitloehner and the way that he has greenwashed the industry. This is an article in the New York Times. He, that being Frank Mitloehner, is an outspoken defender of meat. Industry funds his research, files show. This is in the Washington Post. Livestock industry co-ops academics to downplay its climate impact, study shows. This is a second article in the Washington Post. The meat industry is doing exactly what big oil does to fight climate change. And here is a paragraph from that second Washington Post article, and let's just give it a read. Like fossil fuel companies that funded research to promote climate skepticism, meat and dairy companies have funded experts to undermine scientific findings. After the United Nations published its report on animal agriculture, for example, Frank Mitloehner, a scientist at the University of California, Davis, challenged the results. Mitloehner did not contest the absolute contributions of beef producers to climate change. Rather, he criticized the report's comparison with the transportation sector, calling the analysis lopsided for counting only vehicle emissions from driving. Still, when the UN authors acknowledged the inconsistency, major news outlets from CNN to Fox ran articles that questioned or outright denied that meat production significantly contributed to climate change. None of the coverage acknowledged the Beef Checkoff Program, an industry initiative that aims to encourage beef sales, had paid Mitloehner $26,000 to conduct his study. Mitloehner, whose training is in animal science, not climate science, remains one of the most prominent academic defenders of big meat. His recent activities include industry presentations and white papers downplaying the climate impacts of methane. Here is the takeaway. Sometimes I hear people say that we shouldn't focus on this academic capture and this greenwashing because it's a defensive tactic and we need to figure out offensive or positive messages, that we shouldn't always be responding. But this media representation highlights another truth. It is very difficult for us to seem news. Everything is happening all the time. Emissions are going up, the rates that animals are killed is going up. So how can we get the media to report on this? Since it is constant, it is never different, and therefore is not news. And what these exposés highlight is that greenwashing and academic capture is something a news organization can understand and report on. And it is a way that, as a movement, we can make our arguments now new, hence news and reporting. Remember, they care about the media reporting. They wouldn't be funding Frank Mitloehner. He wouldn't be doing his research. He wouldn't be going to the industry and saying, my value is my ability to shift the media representation, if they did not care about the media representation. So I think we should believe their arguments. We should take those arguments seriously, and we should seize upon the ability that we have to show that the industry itself is tricking consumers. Many of these people who have published these articles are not themselves vegetarian, are not themselves vegan, but they still care about being tricked by an industry. If we go back to our analogy of tobacco, one of the ways that we were able to decrease the use of tobacco was by helping people to understand that the tobacco industry was tricking consumers. And once this industry trust had been lost, then a host of policy initiatives and social behavior could change. Likewise, as activists, what we should do is help people to understand that they do not need to be trusting big ag if they are engaging in academic capture and greenwashing. And we can get those news stories out. So that's the first half. That is Cowgate. We applied and got a grant, so it's completely free. Anyone can read it online. So if you have a chance, give it a read, and it will summarize everything that I just talked about. The second part is the grant that was from the Climate Social Science Network. So this is an article that just came out last month, and it is now focused on a mentorship program in Canada. Now, the most common question I get is why Canada? And let me answer that question in two ways. The first way is simply Canada is an important place that matters. I was not a person who was somehow passionately aware of Canadian rights before I began this research, but I am now. So when I was doing the research about Frank Mitloehner, no one ever asked me why the United States. Not a single time. Since I've been doing the research on Canada, which is like the world's 5th largest exporter of beef, as a significant contributor to beef production, and the question I get is why Canada? So Canada just is a place that should be studied, that is important, and that does matter just on its own. The second answer, which we'll come back to, is that because the government of Canada believes in climate change, because the government of Canada believes animal agriculture causes climate change, they're in a certain sense ahead of where we're trying to push in many other countries. And what it reveals is, despite this belief in climate change, despite this belief in animal agriculture causing climate change, if that money is then given to the industry, for the industry to self-police, what can be happening is the industry itself being government funded to greenwash, to the degree of shifting what is being taught in schools. So it is both important in and of itself, and it is important as a sort of warning of where we are headed unless we as a movement take this academic and greenwashing seriously. So we started with UN Long Shadow. There has, after that, been a host, plethora of other peer-reviewed studies that have all come to the same conclusion. I've summarized 6 of them here. There are many, many more that have all said over and over again that animal agriculture is vastly polluting. To summarize just one, 2018, one of the best done, Poor at the University of Oxford actually went to, this wasn't theoretical, they actually went and did a full life cycle analysis of 40,000 farms in 119 countries, not theoretical, actual life cycle analysis. And based on this, he determined that avoiding meat and dairy is the single largest contribution an individual can make to sustainability. It is worth noting as a side that Poor himself was neither vegetarian or vegan when he started this research. He became vegan after completing the research based on his findings. So he's in no way biased whatsoever at the beginning and informed by that data. So this is still, I would say, the gold standard of research that was done. But it's been done in a host of other ways. Other data has found that it will be impossible for us to prevent the 1.5 degree warming, which is probably already occurring, and very difficult, if not impossible, to even prevent the 2% degree of warming as well as meet the Paris Climate Accords if we don't deal with emissions from agriculture, even if all emissions from fossil fuels vanished today. So a growing body of research. How has the industry responded now 20 years later? Well, this is one way. They've created a mentorship program by the BCRC. Now, the BCRC is a fascinating organization. It is funded by this checkoff program. If you remember earlier, when I was reading from the Washington Post, it mentioned that Frank Mitloehner's research was funded by a checkoff program, a beef checkoff program in the U.S. context. What is a checkoff program? It is a tax, a levy, a government tax. It's a government law, a government tax. So the government taxes, in this case, cattle, every single time cattle is bought and sold. It generates lots of money, generates over $18 million a year. But then what the government does is it takes this $18 million that it has by taxing, and it doesn't keep the money. It gives the money back to the industry for the explicit purpose of increasing sales. By law, the industry then has to use this government money, this tax money, to increase the sales of the industry. If you would like one policy recommendation from all of this research right now, it's we should get rid of checkoff programs. We should get rid of checkoff programs in the United States. We should get rid of checkoff programs in Canada. We should get rid of checkoff programs anywhere they're related to animal agriculture. In a world in which animal agriculture is one of the leading causes of climate change, we do not need any government program to increase the sales. So the BCRC is funded by this checkoff program. And the BCRC, this Beef Cattle Research Council, has two stated goals. One, to fund scientific research, and two, to increase the demand for beef. By law, they have to increase the demand for beef. They're using checkoff dollars. And there is simply an inherent contradiction between these two dictates when it comes to climate science. Climate science that argues that we need to decrease the consumption of meat simply cannot be funded by the checkoff program, no matter how good it is. And perhaps climate science that argues it can be easily solved or we don't need to solve it could be funded. So there's simply an inherent conflict of interest. I would add the BCRC. So even though it sounds very professional, this Beef Cattle Research Council, it is run by producers, not scientists. They have a paid scientist on the council, but is actually run by producers and is wholly run by Big Ag. So here you can see the committee of producers run it, and it's guided by these desires. And it has this mandatory conflict of interest. So the BCRC created a mentorship program, and it is in essence a reverse mentorship program. What do I mean by that? When we imagine a mentorship program, you might imagine that they would take the top scientist and have them mentor the industry on how to do a better job. And we might be okay with that. We might want to make sure there's no conflict of interest, but we might say, hey, there's some legitimate benefit in the top scientists working on emissions, mentoring the industry for the industry to do a better job. This mentorship works exactly the opposite way. It takes two people from the industry, always someone who owns a feedlot, and a second one, usually an industry consultant. So two mentors, including always someone who owns a feedlot in every example that we'll talk about, mentoring junior scientists explicitly on what to research. So it is not scientists mentoring the industry, it is feedlot owners mentoring scientists. Now, the mentorship program does lots of different things, forage, management, all these sorts of different things, but it also includes research about climate change. And that is what I want to focus on today. I want to focus on a government funding organization creating a mentorship program of people who own feedlots and paid industry consultants mentoring junior researchers on what to research. And here you'll see a quotation at the beginning. This is a researcher in the Canadian government on the website and the promotional video saying the reason he has his job is because of this mentorship program and his ability to secure funding that has relevance to producers, i.e. helps Big Ag. And before I even get into the details, I would simply ask, in what other area would this be considered acceptable? If a researcher from the Environmental Protection Agency publicly stated the reason he had his job was because of a mentorship program he went through, or he was mentored by the fossil fuel industry, would we accept someone at the Food and Drug Administration engaged in tobacco research who said the only reason he had his job was because of a mentorship program, paid mentorship program? The researchers get money, a paid mentorship program by the tobacco industry. So why is it that somehow uniquely in the area of Big Ag, of animal agriculture, there's a kind of innocence, a kind of presumption of goodwill that people can publicly say what might be career-ending statements in other contexts, and here it's reproduced on the website and reproduced in the promotional video as not a concern at all. It's not a concern on his website. It's not a concern to anyone at all as far as I can tell. So it's a reverse mentorship program. The claim is that it's mutually beneficial. That's the phrase they use. That's not my phrase. It's used multiple times by the BCRC. It's beneficial to the researchers because they get, this is another direct quotation, a really big leg up by becoming, another direct quotation, part of the family of Big Ag, and so that they're able to get better jobs, mutually beneficial to the junior researcher. It is beneficial to the industry because they get to make sure that the research questions that are asked align and help the industry. Again, that's explicitly on the website. You can see practical and beneficial to Canada's beef industry. So it aligns the rewards and therefore constitutes an example of academic capture. Here it is directly from the website. You can just read it. Align research interest with those that are practical and beneficial to Canada's beef industry. It's the number one. So we don't have to imagine that this is academic capture. It's stated. They're taking government money, $18 million, and using it to help fund a program completely run, not by scientists, but by the producers to pay junior researchers to be mentored by people who own feedlots and industry consultants for the stated purpose that you can read from the website to align the research interest with those that are practical and beneficial to Canada's beef industry. And they are doing it to researchers explicitly studying beef production in Canada and climate change. So the paper, Becoming Part of the Family, goes through a few specific case studies. So these are individual researchers that went through, and we'll just briefly take a look at 3 examples. Researchers, junior researchers who went through this program and received this funding and training. So this is Stephanie Terry. And just as an aside, the day this article came out, the BCRC asked for a copy of it, which of course I sent them. The next day after this came out, Stephanie Terry emailed me and asked for a copy of this article, which of course I sent to her. So she is a junior researcher focused on nutritional and technological strategies to mitigate ruminant greenhouse gas production, so that greenhouse gas produced by the cattle. And one of her researchers, her mentors in this program, was Ryan Casco. He operates somewhere between 40 to 45,000 cattle in his industrial feedlot. He's also the president of Alberta's Cattle Feeder Association. He co-runs a marketing group with the stated purpose to promote the mutual growth and improve greater industry success for feedlots. And here's a photo of what his farm looks like. To be clear, this photo was not taken by People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. This photo was not taken by the Humane Society. This is off of his own website. It is presumably the best photo they could possibly find. Here's one close-up of what those cows look like. So that is who is mentoring a researcher about environmental effects of beef production in Canada. So what do we find? Dr. Stephanie Terry went to this mentorship program and she published 2 articles. The articles acknowledge the impact that animal agriculture has on the environment, but they also have these disclaimers that eating meat is essential for human health and essential for the environment, and then suggest that all of the concerns about the environment can be solved by changing the feed additives. And so if we just change the feed additives, we don't need to worry about the larger environmental impacts from the cattle. And at no point do they discuss the need or the possibility to decrease the number of cows that are raised at all. She was also part of a meeting, and this goes back to Why Canada, between the EU and Canada, government-funded, only scientists. And the report from this meeting ends with the need to, quote, tell the good news about animal agriculture to the public, including school children. If you are curious, is it odd for scientists to release a report that says that their job as scientists is to tell the good news story of the industry? Yes, it is. The report did not call for the objective dissimulation of scientific facts. They were called to tell the good news story. And it included the need to tell the good news story of feed additives in particular. Stephanie's, Terry's specific area of research. Second case study, Trevor Coates. He again had 2 mentors. One was Rich Smith, a retired executive director of the Alberta Beef Producers, whose stated goal, quoted directly from their website, is to bolster recognition of the environmental benefits of feedlot systems. So not only does it pollute, but their claim is that it's good for the environment. The environmental benefits of feedlot systems is the stated claim on the website of the organization of one of his mentors. The other mentor, again, was the owner of a feedlot. In fact, in this case, 2 feedlots that combined raise 70,000 cows a year and is trying to increase the number of cows that they're allowed to do. Their website didn't have any of the photos, but this is from their Facebook. I haven't changed it at all, originally in black and white. You can see it's so crowded that you couldn't even walk around. Indeed, they have a video of on their Facebook of people trying to walk, and they can't. This is an aerial view of the second of the feedlots. You can see there is no grass. It's a feedlot. So what was the result from Trevor Coates' mentorship? He co-authored a study promoting the use of brown coal, a toxic byproduct, by the fossil fuel industry in feedlots for environmental benefit. So his argument is you take the brown coal and you go composting style, they're composting, you combine it with the manure, and it helps to absorb the ammonium. He recommended the use of this, the use of brown coal, even though his first study found that it would actually increase greenhouse gas emissions. Unsurprising, because it is a byproduct of the fossil fuel industry. Just mining the coal produces emissions. Now, to be clear and fair, he did have a second study that said that if you change some composting styles and the way that the brown coal is made, he thinks you can decrease those emissions and maybe even make the greenhouse gas emissions sustainable. But even in the first study that said the emissions went up, he still recommended its use. He was on an industry-funded podcast. So this is part of the telling the good news story that was specifically mentioned in that earlier report. And on this podcast, he mentioned the Netherlands. If you remember, I began how the Netherlands have steadily decreased the per consumption of meat through government policies and regulation. And he was asked specifically about this. And he said not to worry, that if they decreased, and I'm summarizing, paraphrasing here, if they decrease their number of cattle, Canada should increase the number of cows that they raise basically in essence changing around the cattle that are there because there was no need to reduce meat consumption. And overall, his argument is, again, minor changes in techniques, in this case in composting styles, can solve all the problems by cow production, and there's no need to decrease the number of cows that are raised for human consumption. Last one. So these first two, the conflict of interest is there. They're doing feed additives, and they're doing composting styles, and they're studying greenhouse gas emissions. But this one, the conflict of interest is dead on. So Jitham Leges is literally studying, defining the environmental footprint of Canadian beef. So how bad is it for the environment? His mentor, the first one, is Charlie Christie, a feedlot owner, again, the chair of Alberta Beef Producers, and remarkably, the defender of this billboard right here. And it is worth taking a look at this billboard. You'll see it says Truth Matters. It is paid for by the University of Alberta. And it says beefier barley, climate change will boost Alberta's beef yield with less water, feeding more cows. So the implication seems to be we don't have to worry about climate change because it will be good for barley production, which will be good for cows. So one of his mentors advocated for that billboard. His other mentor, his other mentor produced these images that talk about how cows are good for the environment, including this one, Save the Birds, Eat Beef. And so this goes back to this earlier argument I had about the ability of people to lie by telling the truth. So it is true that grass does provide some habitat for birds, but it is also true, as we began, with the fact that overall animal agriculture is the single leading cause of species extinction and biodiversity loss. So since grassland provides some habitat for birds, this one true statement, in essence, is used to lie to produce a claim, save the birds, eat beef, a claim that no peer-reviewed data has ever found. So, but this graphic was produced by his other mentor. So what are the results? What did he come up with? He did a study that just looked at the intensity per kilogram of beef production in Canada. And what he found is if you look at beef production in Canada from 1981 to 2011, I'm not sure why those dates were chosen. The report doesn't make it clear. But if you take these particular dates and you look between these dates per kilogram of beef production in Canada, it went down by 15%. And as I've done this research and I've talked to people in Canada, several people have told me, oh, I thought that emissions had gone down. I thought they had gone down by 15%. But what the research paper actually found is total emissions had gone up by 28%. So actual emissions, what really matters for the environment doesn't matter per kilogram. What matters is actual emissions had gone up by 28%. But the way it was framed, because they only looked at per kilogram, it went down by 15% per kilogram. And then the BCRC, this graphic you're looking at, was funded by BCRC, went out to the public in a marketing campaign that told everybody less gas, 15% less gas, because they're only looking at the per kilogram rate, even though the actual study went up. And this is a summary of that funding. And what I would highlight here is how the BCRC is controlling every single part of this. So the BCRC has the mentorship program. The BCRC funds the study. The BCRC then promotes the finding from the study. And so the public sees this, even though in reality, total emissions have increased in the study, in the time period of the study, by 28%. To be clear, emissions vary all the time because of a range of factors. It is not true that emissions have only steadily inclined after the end of the study. Emissions have declined during COVID and various factors. The point is a study that found total emissions increasing via these rhetorical techniques is presented to the public as emissions have declined, in which to this day many Canadians believe, including policymakers. So what are the takeaways? How do they work? What are the techniques of this strategic academic capture? Selective inclusion, only certain questions are asked. The BCRC actually openly admits this. They say, look, we control what questions they ask, but they're allowed to come to whatever conclusion they want. Therefore, it is okay. My argument is controlling what questions are asked is the problem. So related to that, aligned incentives. So suppose someone wants to prove the total carrying capacity of cattle. Presumably they would get no funding. They would get no ability to access the farms. It would not be mutually beneficial to them. And suppose a completely non-biased committee is evaluating the CV of a researcher whose work is helpful to the industry versus one that is not, just on the objective criteria of grants, funding, access, and publications. They might well give that government job to the researcher favorable to the industry and not to the one that is critical. So these verbs of mutually beneficial, a really big leg up, becoming part of that family, has within it a kind of implicit threat. If all these benefits go to researchers helpful to the industry, what happens to a researcher critical of the industry? The third is methodological framing, this sort of ability to lie by only telling the truth. So the questions that get funded, like the tobacco industry earlier, that would fund whatever kind of research, even if it was completely valid, that might cause lung cancer, as long as you didn't argue it was tobacco. Again, much of this research was absolutely valid. Some of our asbestos research came from it. But the purpose was to confuse the public. I argue we can see a similar purpose at play where the beef industry is happy to fund whatever kind of research you want to do, feed additives, composting styles, whatever it is, as long as you simply don't ask the question, why do we need so many cows? What if we had less? Then in addition, the public communication aspect. So all this research has to go through peer-reviewed. The peer-reviewed articles are the least of the problem, but how many people read a peer-reviewed article? So it's also the way that they talk on podcast, their public statements, these reports, the marketing that the industry itself does and then cites this research. The fact that the scientists themselves say that they now need to tell the good news story, that they're hosting podcasts, and that they're going into the schools. The fifth one is the hijacking of the word sustainability. You will hear this term used by the industry all the time. But I'm here to tell you today what they mean by that term sustainable is that the industry stays profitable. They say, oh, we need to get a round table. We all need to come together and we need to be sustainable. And they mean we need to keep the industry growing, continuing and growing. Well, that is a meaning of sustainability, but it is not the meaning of sustainability that climate scientists use. And by confusing sustainability to mean the industry needs to stay sustainable, that we need to be profitable, that we need to grow big ag, that hijacking of the term sustainable, that framing masks what's really going on. And the sixth part is this institutional silence. Indeed, increasingly, I'm seeing examples of institutional pride where governments, where universities, where researchers say, hey, I got my job because of my ties to the industry. Well, presidents of universities are saying, hey, we consider this an example of how academics and industry can always work together. And so in the same way that we would be concerned if someone from the fossil fuel industry, the same way we're concerned someone from the tobacco industry had these kind of ties, why is it that we are not concerned when there are similar ties from big agriculture and academics specifically on the question of animal agriculture and climate change? I would highlight that even if someone does not care about animals whatsoever, this is still a scandal that they should be concerned about. It's concerning in terms of research ethics, it's concerning in terms of academic independence, and it's concerning in terms of climate change. What I'm arguing for is simply objective research without industry influence, and that should be something that everyone should support. And I want to focus in on why I care about this so much. So here's that good news thing that I was at the end of a government-funded meeting from Canada and the European Union. And this is their conclusion of this mass meeting of only scientists and researchers. And this is what they said. Often, Mainstream media focuses on the negatives associated with livestock production, such as GHG, that's greenhouse gas emissions, and deforestation. However, it's important to tell consumers the good news stories about the industry, including the benefits livestock production brings to biodiversity and grasslands. That save the birds, eat beef argument we saw earlier. Outreach on the benefits of the livestock industry can begin in the school system by teaching students more about the sources of their food. And this is not theoretical. The Canadian government is already having this in the schools today, the public schools. And the students have to role play as people who own factory farms. They have to review data that the industry has helped to produce. And they have to practice answering back arguments by animal activists based on this data that they have read. Role play as the owner of the feedlot, as school children in public schools, and answer it back. There's another slide that's not here where they literally, the note to the teacher is make sure that the students don't get too emotional and that they just use our data. Here's another one. This is by Guardians of the Grassland. That's an industry-funded documentary. And notice what it says, number 5. The Canadian beef industry practices sustainability and conservation efforts. And today in Canada, there is a student in the public schools who has to mark that true, or his teacher marks it wrong. So, here is the main takeaway. This academic capture and this greenwashing matters. It matters in terms of the media. It matters in terms of policymakers. It matters in terms of our ability to actually decrease the consumption of meat as is happening in the Netherlands. And it matters in terms of what people are teaching in the schools today. Canada is where many other countries, including the United States, will be at in the future if we manage to make the government care about climate change and believe in animal agriculture, but don't manage to prevent the greenwashing and the strategic capture. If we don't want our students anywhere to have true false questions like this, we have to let people know what is really going on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vasile, for that extremely informative talk, shocking talk, motivating talk. Also really gives a window into the kind of research you've been doing now, I don't know, almost rounding up to a decade maybe at this point on this subject. And so, I don't really know who else is doing such deep work, and also work that's very public facing or public oriented in terms of, say, schools, public outlets, and so on. So I really appreciate your ability to bridge from kind of the peer-reviewed realm to the mainstream. So I'm going to pivot. I have some questions, but I'm going to pivot to the Q&A. Vasile, do you want me to stop sharing your screen?
Yeah, if you don't mind. Thanks.
Let me see how to do that.
Thanks, man.
Sometimes I know how to do that. One second here. I will do something very quickly. Sorry, everybody. Anyway, I'm going to read a question, and as I'm dealing with the screen share, Vasile can answer it. So the first question here is from Grace Hussein, who writes, one issue research and academia is facing is the public's flagging trust in science. How do we call out the industry takeover of science research without contributing to the public distrust? Also, if you me kind of, because I had a very, very similar question, but I want to give an example from your talk, and then I think you'll answer both at the same time. You gave that example at the beginning of this kind of label of scientist, right? Scientist says this. And what it seems to do is kind of present the situation, not that that scientist is right, but that, look, another scientist is saying something completely different. Science doesn't really even know what it's talking about. Hence, we kind of all can make up the decision for ourselves. So I think this is what I was thinking, but Grace says it very well when they write, how do we call out the industry when there's a flagging trust in science?
Yes, I think that's a fantastic question. And um, one of the things that stands out to me and that I emphasize is that what the BCRC is doing is it is not saying that we should align the industry with the best possible science. In fact, the website says exactly the opposite. So I think as vegan activists, sometimes we have a sort of tension or hostility against science, and that's understandable because of things like animal testing and a sort of legacy that makes us concerned. But the truth is that the vast majority of valid peer-reviewed data argues that we have to make severe changes and decrease our consumption of meat. This is not somehow one study, this is a plethora of studies across the board. What we're arguing is the scientific consensus and is the industry that's trying to lead the other way. So, like with the fossil fuel industry, like with the tobacco industry, we are the ones that are presenting just the clear, unbiased data. All we need to argue for is objective research without industry ties, and that is what will actually produce the changes that we want.
Moving on, next attendee asks, what is the origin of the socialized association that the industry capitalizes on between masculinity and meat consumption? I don't know if the origin question is a fair question to ask, but maybe if you want to talk about that in its relation to your work, perhaps.
Sure. Yeah. So I did not discuss masculinity and meat consumption in this presentation, but there's plenty of other people who do, most famously Carol Adams in The Sexual Politics of Meat. I do talk about it in length in a separate published paper that anyone can take a look at, White Power Milk. And it is true that there is a historical linkage between colonialism, meat eating, and masculinity. And basically, what happened is that there was union organizing that was happening in the United States where workers were trying to demand higher wages. The way they articulated this demand for higher wages is they needed enough money to be able to bring home the bacon. They needed enough money to be able to have a chicken in every pot, phrases we still have today. And the response to this was not to raise their wages, but to steadily decrease the cost of meat. It changed recently with COVID, but until COVID, there were several decades in which meat consumption was negatively correlated with inflation. So, what does that mean? That means every single year it got cheaper to eat meat, even as real wages fell. And what this meant is people felt wealthy. They were eating more meat than ever before, even though in reality their own wages went down. And this is not an unimportant part of our advocacy. If we ask, well, what was the problem the factory farm was invented to solve? If necessity is the mother of invention, what was the necessity that created the factory farm? And at least part of that answer was to be able to produce ever cheaper meat to reassure a white male working class in the United States that they still had a good deal, even as their wages steadily got worse.
Thank you. The next question asks, and this might be tangential, what is the legal basis for banning cell-cultured meat? Or, yeah, I don't know if that you want to answer that, or you want to refer them to some other work that you've done on this topic.
Sure. So I am also a critic of cell cultured meat. I have a edited volume, co-edited volume coming out from Routledge. We just sent the final proof off to the publisher like last week, so I'm not sure exactly when it's been published, but it should be published relatively soon. And there's a host of problems with cellular meat, one of which is this environmental argument. The majority of peer-reviewed data that has come out on cellular meat suggests that it might be worse for the environment than even the feedlot systems. Of course, it'll be way better in terms of land and water usage, but in terms of energy, greenhouse gas emissions, climate change, it might way be worse. If you think of how cellular meat is made, it's in essence elaborate meat gyms that have to stretch apart. Meat means muscle. That's to stretch apart this meat. And the meat gems, these huge bioreactors, the majority of peer-reviewed data, there are exceptions, it's not all, but the majority of the data that's come out suggests that it might well be worse for climate change than even the meat that we have now. So I am critical of lab-grown meat.
Great. Thanks. And I know we're going to have more on that in the future. I mean, obviously, it's just going to become more of a topic as time goes on, and we all look forward to that volume coming out. So we'd love to have you back in some capacity or your co-editors when that happens. The next question from Mayor Shah. It seems that the greenwashing problem is multi-layered, with media, industry, lobbyists, and politicians seemingly working in unison. What can we do? What can we as individuals actionably do to fight greenwashing, especially to support systemic macro level change?
Yes, that's a fantastic question. And so increasingly, my research is focused on including this second grant. So originally it was like, okay, here's what these researchers are doing, and here's how it ties in the industry. And then as I'm doing this research, what I'm finding is exactly what you're talking about, where there's connections with the state that's funding it. So for example, these checkoff programs are tax money that the government takes as a tax and gives to the industry. So there's connections there. And then there's connections within the academy. So there's presidents of universities who are praising these connections. There's people in the government. So they go through this mentorship, they get to be in this government. So it's a multi-level way in which they go together. And the term I've used is this kind of innocence, presumed innocence. Why is it that animal agriculture is somehow presumed more innocent than the tobacco industry? And why is it presumed more innocent than the fossil fuel industry? And relatedly, how can we change this perception? A similar rhetoric used to exist around, say, the tobacco industry. They're farmers. They're growing this product. We have to protect their jobs. And part of the way that we won was shifting the discourse for people to realize that the industry itself was tricking people. And so something we can do, one of the reasons I believe in this type of work, is to help get out the message that this is not an industry that should be trusted, that we can tell ways in which they are engaging in strategic capture and climate denial type work, and that this can help alert people to what is going on. And we are able to get that message out, as we've noticed in a host of different ways, and that this message could change government regulation, what government does. It can change what consumers think. It is a message that we can win.
Mm. I've done a really good job. Usually I'm really not good at getting right to the questions and I kind of having my own thoughts, but I tried to really make sure I'd get all the questions at first. But this is a moment where I do want to ask you something
Please.
about this, which is that the one of the biggest struggles, it seems, at least as I was listening to you speak, was that we're all operating right between a political and economic system that is, say, a contemporary capitalistic system that really makes things so much more difficult to change, if not at times impossible. I'm not going to say impossible, but improbable. And I guess my question is, how effective or what is possible when you have an economic system that actually doesn't prioritize well-being at all by its very definition, right? So the government, private industries have actually no responsibility to take care of the environment or individuals, human or non-human, in any capacity, because that's actually not a grounding principle of the system. And secondly is the idea that you talked earlier about how researchers were really interested in their job prospects, right? And that's also coupled to a current system that does not guarantee people livelihoods in any way. So you have to be consistently concerned about quote unquote making a living, right? Because otherwise you're not living. And so I guess my question is a big one, however you want to enter it, which is all of these questions about how we intervene, aren't they part of a larger question of a system that is not even putting well-being as a priority value?
Yes, I absolutely agree. I know you've published work on this as well. So there's another article called Slaughterhouse Capitalism that came out in Current Affairs. It's a sort of popular press version of a larger academic article and book that I'm currently working on. And so I completely agree with you. But what I'll say is that I am always believes in two things, both absolute pragmatism and absolute radicalism simultaneously.
Mhm.
So, is it true that there are linkages between animal agriculture and capitalism, that they sort of help to jointly reinforce themselves? And I know that you are hosting a class by Dinesh Wadiwell where you'll actually read through together Animal Capital, and I think that's fantastic. I agree with that 100%. That is a large part of my own scholarship. That is what I believe. We've already talked about some of those historical linkages where workers fighting for higher wages got bought off by animals being treated less well. So there are a host of different ways that these work together. And I'm critical of consumerist options, of trying to sell things. I'm critical of people who praise capitalism as a way to solve what is happening to animals. I don't think it's going to work. I don't think the consumerist option of humane meat is going to work, of cage-free is going to work, of lab-grown meat is going to work. Part of my critique of lab-grown meat is the way that it doesn't really deal with the problem of capitalism. These companies will be bought by Cargill or Tyson. That the people who own the companies have said their goal is to sell to Cargill, and that Cargill has said their goal is to buy them, and usually 2 + 2 = 4. And so the question is not, are they theoretically possible to help the environment? Is there some imagined company run only by vegans that could do things in a correct way? But what we'll actually see in the real world when Cargill owns this technology. And I don't think it's going to help either animals or the environment. At the same time, what I would also say is that it is possible to make real progress that matters while we fight for more revolutionary change. It has been possible for us to affect things that have happened in terms of tobacco consumption. It's possible to affect things in a host of other areas. And so we always need to be doing both. We need to be fighting. I mean, the Netherlands hasn't somehow stopped having any degree of capitalism, and meat consumption is going down. So it is possible to make changes that matter pragmatically today, while we still fight for larger changes at the same time. That doesn't trade off. That is not untrue. And we can do both at the same time.
Great. Thanks so much. So getting back to attendees, why is almost everyone silent about the 2009 World Watch paper by World Bank experts Robert Goodland and Jeff Anhang? Was it seminal or fundamentally flawed? I can link this in the chat, right? This is another, I think that's the one that says that something like 51% of all greenhouse gases come from
animal agriculture. Yes. No, it's a good paper. It's an important paper. I have emailed with them multiple times, including back and forth, including right after it came out. So it is not a paper that I dismiss in any way. The key assumption they make, they sort of make 2 key assumptions, which I agree with, but have not permanently caught on with the larger environmental community. So I'll briefly explain what those key assumptions are and why I focus on what is sort of a consensus, even though I still agree with these 2 arguments. Their argument is this. Most analysis of the greenhouse gas emissions from cattle production assumes that we haven't changed the amount. So, for example, it doesn't assume the respiration, the breathing of air, of just breathing in and out of the cows. But we should. We've radically increased the amount of animals, and they're just breathing out way more than they would normally. And so that's one of the gases that hasn't been focused on. So that continues to be a controversial claim, even though I think it's a valid one. We should assume, okay, we're really increasing the number of animals who are breathing, and we should actually focus in on this breathing that the animals are doing, even though that normally isn't counted in the grasses. Their other argument, which I think is even the stronger one, is that we tend not to focus on what could be done with all this land. So 80% of all agricultural land is used to produce animal agriculture. 80% of all land used for agriculture is used to produce animal agriculture. That 80% of land that's used for agriculture is pretty much 80% of land used by humans, since almost all the land we use is actually for agriculture. It's something around 1% is used for like all cities combined. So it's just a vast amount of land that's being used. So what is also not done, even in these favorable studies that I cited, so you remember that earlier chart that had like 6 different ones, they don't factor in what happens if we used all that land to like plant trees and we're able to absorb the carbon. We've got all this land back and we didn't use it as a zero, but we actually used it in a way that could help decrease the environmental impacts. So this sort of missed opportunity is also not factored in. So if you factor in changing the total number of animals that exist, if you factor in their breathing, so an actual like breathing out of carbon, and you factor in this missed opportunity analysis, that's how you get to this sort of 51%. So it doesn't mean it's wrong, it's a different set of analysis. So even though I'm quite sympathetic to it, I think these are important parts and we need to give them out. I tend not to focus on it. Why? Because my part is that there's an academic consensus on how harmful animal agriculture is. And the studies I've done all agree with each other and are a consensus. So while I'm sympathetic to that paper, it is still the truth that there is a consensus that animal agriculture is at least the number 2 cause of greenhouse gas emissions after the fossil fuel industry, and that it is impossible to meet the Paris Climate Accords or prevent the 1.5 or 2 degree change, even if all fossil fuels vanish like that, unless we deal with animal agriculture. Everyone agrees that it's possible.
Seems like we'll be reaching two no matter what, at least from what I've been reading. But at least, given our inaction in recent years. Um, so there's a question from Monica who asks, is there a similar phenomena of journalistic capture such that what is considered newsworthy is also governed by industry interest? To what extent are writing op-eds and critical engagement with the narrative an effective strategy to resist? Just before you answer, there seems to be a question after that about nutritionists who are tied to industry. So it's kind of like journalistic capture or nutrition capture, kind of all wrapped up in one. So I guess it's a broader question about capture across the board.
This is a brilliant question. And so let me answer the journalist capture one. And the answer is not nearly as well as the industry would like. So the presentation highlights how particular publications have shifted, literally the same publication, from an earlier story to a different one. And as we noticed from Mitloehner and McLean's, literally the same journalist. But what also it highlights is these journalists are still willing to carry stories highly critical of the industry. So, and I think this absolutely matters. These sort of stories, look, the industry is focused on these stories. Most of what I go to isn't animal rights conferences and meetings, even though I value them and I get a lot out of them. To the degree I can, I try to go to the industry conferences. That's how I found out about Frank Mitloehner's speech. And what they care about is exactly this. They care about academic capture. So, for example, there was a presentation that was done for Lethbridge manure management. But the first two presentations had nothing to do with manure management. They were by PR consultants. So they did have to do with bullshit, but not in the way that one would have mattered. Mm-hmm. And what they said is, hey, we need to focus on academics. Academics are cheap and they have high status. And here is a bunch of data to prove how people will believe and listen to them. And so if we can shift what academics say, then we can shift the media. They had examples for what to say in the media, like we also live in this community. We're family farms. And you can watch, and I've been able to watch what consultants are telling the industry and what you'll literally see consultants say, what you'll literally see the industry say in print. So shifting the stories matters. It is absolutely an area where we can achieve real wins that really matter. Who is going to read a peer-reviewed study? What they are going to take in is what they see in the popular press. Are there attempts to control the journalist? Absolutely. Can we still get out stories that matter? Yes, we do all the time, and we need to do it more.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to hold my tongue because I have a few more questions. First of all, as always, this is from Agni Hogaboom asks, first of all, as always, thank you so much for your work. My question is about the disavow culture developing amongst vegan influencers and leaders in the very influential world of social media. Recently, I saw two influential vegans on different platforms, one a leftist activist and the other a venture capitalist, claim, quote, nothing has worked to get people to eat less meat, before they went on to advance their own specific single strategy platform. How do we as vegan activists, scholars, scientists, advocates, and organizers push back or ameliorate this culture of vegan disavow and hyperbole? Should we ignore disavow and despair statements by popular and powerful vegan voices or engage with them?
This might be the most important question throughout. One of my pet peeves that I have spent a lot of time responding to is this myth that almost no one is vegetarian or vegan, or that almost no one will ever go vegetarian or vegan, and that somehow it is human nature to eat meat, and that we will only ever have increasing rates of meat consumption. So there's a lengthy blog post that I did explaining all of the data that went through that showed that the numbers that we often hear of very small amounts of vegetarians or vegans is inaccurate. There's a follow-up Substack that goes through more data. The meat industry itself, in the United States context, does a monthly, not yearly, monthly survey of the number of vegetarians and vegans. So we have tons of data. It's every single month. And the bias is totally pro the industry. It's the checkoff program. The checkoff program funds this. And they find far higher rates of vegetarians or vegans than we hear activists say. So why is it that the meat industry thinks there's way more vegetarians or vegans than vegetarians and vegans think that there are? And how this gets reported matters. There's a large and growing body of data about stigma that says the major reason why people are not going vegetarian or vegan or staying vegetarian or vegan is they feel isolated, alone, and stigmatized. So every single time it's reported that almost no one is vegetarian or vegan, that almost no one will go vegetarian or vegan, that it's human nature to eat meat. This becomes, the data seems to suggest, a self-fulfilling prophecy. If no one's doing it, why should I? That is already one of the number of arguments I hear when I talk to people. Even if I'm right about anything, if we can't make a difference, why try? And so as activists and academics and policymakers, one of the number one things that we need to get out to people is there's large numbers of people going vegetarian or vegan. That is happening in multiple countries around the world. That 10% of people in various countries are going vegetarian or vegan. And as I've already mentioned, there are countries already where the average meat consumption is going down. So it is clearly, just obviously, not human nature to eat meat. We can clearly shift how much meat that people do. And as activists, we should getting this winning message out to as many people as possible.
Thank you. I'm going to apologize to Zipporah Weisberg, who had a question that came before this, who's here right now. And I want to ask her question. For those who don't know, Zipporah gave our talk in June on animal sanctuaries. And she asks, well, first she says, fantastic talk. Thank you so much. My question is whether you intend on taking your findings further towards some kind of policy intervention, or if you will keep this discussion within the academic domain. Either way, so important. Thank you.
Yes, so there, like I say, I have the second grant, so the research that is to come is focused on endowed chairs. What is an endowed chair? It is in sort of the academic hierarchy, kind of the highest. So you have like assistant, associate, full professor, and endowed chair. So these are industry endowed chairs. Here's what's happening. The industry, big ag, is going to universities and they're saying, hey, we will give you a free researcher. You don't have to pay anything. We'll pay 100% of their salary. But we got a few stipulations. We get to choose who you hire, and their contract requires them to report back to us. So this is already happening. There are these endowed chairs, and these endowed chairs are making public-facing statements, including to sitting senators, saying the industry isn't polluting, that we should increase the size of the industry, and that it's good for the environment. I've already mentioned the schools, the things that are going into the schools. The industry is even trying to get government funding, saying, hey, we're so great for the environment. We've done so much greenwashing. You should cut us a check to keep our industry going. So we cannot ignore the policy side. And there are clear, obvious, and actionable policy implications that we together can use to fight the industry. Checkoff programs should be gone. Government funding of big ag should be gone. The ability for them to have paid researchers, endowed chairs, should end. Disclosure should be required. All of these are achievable policy goals that could have real world effects. And most importantly, we shouldn't have school children being taught that the industry is sustainable and that they have to role play as factory farmers to answer back animal rights activists.
I'm going to ask one more. I'm sorry if I didn't get to all the questions, but we're over time and I want to respect everyone's time. And so I like this question because it also points to some work that you've done in the past. Juan Yaramillo, I hope I've pronounced their name correctly, writes, thank you for the illuminating talk. My question is whether you think the academic strategic capture technique is also used in traditional conservation efforts to demonize so-called invasive species. Although there is no clear link between any industry and the tendency of conservationists to exterminate those species. It looks like a dogma that refuses to dissolve in light of new data indicating that quote unquote invasives are not as destructive as traditional conservationists want us believe. I mean, not to mention the term itself, and it's very racialized in colonial history, but that's another question.
Yes, absolutely. So I have an article called The Judas Pig directly on this topic. My brother co-edited a volume on it that includes this chapter, James Stănescu, and he and I both take exception exactly to this point, invasive. The term I prefer is refugee species. We push back that there isn't a clear industry connection. There absolutely is. The Nature Conservancy, one of this larger corporations and nonprofits that's pushing to eradicate invasive species, has been documented as quote unquote a big green because they take so much money from like the fossil fuel industry and what have you. And it's a way to shift the blame. So in reality, the number one cause of species extinction, as we talked about, is animal agriculture. So it's the raising and killing of 80 to 90 billion animals each and every year. And then what this sort of rhetoric does is shift the focus and say, you know who we need to blame? The animals themselves. And you know what we need to do? We need to kill more of them. And so it's a way to shift from the changes that actually need to occur, another way to lie by telling the truth, and shift from, hey, we actually need to care and value animals, to we should be at war against invasive species or to blame, even though we're destroying every possible place that they have to live. Have you ever heard the story of the woman who swallowed the fly and then she swallows all these other animals? There's a little bit of that as well. Well, we will kill one so-called invasive species. It will cause another species to grow in number. Then we'll have to go in and kill that one. And then we'll call another species to grow. And then we have to go and kill that one. And we're like, look how important and essential humans are for protecting animals and nature. But in reality, none of that is true.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. And I really, we don't have the time for it, but even when folks are talking about plant species, I really encourage a reflection and analysis of whenever anyone is using this language of invasiveness, because it has this very selective usage. I heard a joke recently, or not a joke, but a take recently, is that why is that when privileged people, especially white people, go and move somewhere else, they're referred to as expats, but when non-white, non-privileged people move somewhere, they're immigrants, right? And this kind of why isn't everyone immigrants? And I think it's this certain way in which why aren't, say, privileged white folks, especially from the global north, referred to as invasives when they go to other countries and settle down, but it's only reserved for certain humans. And so I I think that that discussion is extremely important, extremely rich, and extremely touchy. But as you brought up, all of this stuff really cuts at the core, whether it's masculinity or class or food or how we organize society. And that's just a roundabout way of me thanking you for doing such research into yet another area that is so impactful for us and our children, as you rightfully pointed out.
Let me just end with a final thank you for each of you. So, as I mentioned before, we have pretty good data about why people don't stay vegetarian or vegan. And it's because they feel alone and isolated, and what they're doing doesn't matter. So, if you are vegetarian or vegan or care about animals, thank you. You are doing the most important work that there is. There is nothing that matters more. It is intersectional and it touches on all of these issues, whether it's race or class or the environment. There's not multiple buckets, there's only one bucket. And you are doing the single most important work that there is. And I am in solidarity with you. And I deeply and profoundly thank you.
Thank you so much. A wonderful reminder. Again, thank you so much for being here, Dr. Stănescu, on the Voices in Vegan Studies series. And I hope to see you all in 2 months' time. In a month, we have our conference, 2 months' time, with Claire Jean Kim, Fighting for Animals in a Time of Danger, on September 21st. See you there, and thank you all for coming.